Last week, I put out a video saying that we found the first tomb of a pharaoh in over 100 years. And I was wrong. And I will always admit when I am wrong or if I've made a mistake. So we're going to have this video to correct it. While, yes, the tomb of King Thutmose II is the first pharaoh's tomb to have been found in the area of the Valley of the Kings in over 100 years, there have been other discoveries of pharaohs' tombs that have gone largely unnoticed, including the only intact royal tomb ever found in Egypt. Contrary to popular belief and the amount of gold and riches found inside, King Tutankhamun's tomb was indeed robbed twice shortly after it was built. There is only one tomb so far that remained hidden for millennia, unscathed by robbers and looters, and still remains largely forgotten to the public. The tomb of Psusenes I, the Silver Pharaoh. Psusenes I is the Greek name for the pharaoh Pasipkanu or Pasipkaniut, which means the star appearing in the city. He was the third pharaoh of the 21st dynasty and ruled from the city of Tanis between 1047 and 1001 BCE. This was the first dynasty of the third intermediate period, a time in Egypt right after the New Kingdom where foreign rulers took control over Egypt for periods of time. The fracturing of the country's kingship occurred. Generally, this period is viewed as one of decline and political instability that included some division of the state. This period also coincided with the late Bronze Age collapse that was seen throughout the ancient Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean when many ancient civilizations fell. The period of the 21st dynasty is where this fracturing kingship first began. Power was held almost equally between Tanis, with the kings possibly residing in Memphis, and Thebes, due to the high priests of Amun in the latter city becoming increasingly more powerful during the end of the 20th dynasty. This essentially became a, quote, secular and religious divide, with the two cities ruling jointly with different agendas. The divide characterized most of the third intermediate period, though I should say here that secular in ancient Egypt doesn't mean non-religious. There's no separation between religious and daily life in ancient Egypt. When I say secular in this context, I mean rulers in Tanis made decisions based upon the current circumstances and were very pragmatic about things, whereas the high priests of Amun at Thebes were a theocracy, consulting the god Amun directly on every aspect of rule. In this sense, Amun essentially could actually be considered the king of Thebes during this time. Even though there seemed to be this great divide, it does appear that there might have been some kind of agreement that this was the best way of doing things, and some collaboration might have happened over the course of the period. This is the world in which Pasipkanu or Psussenes I came to rule. The precise length of Psussenes I's reign is unknown because there are different copies of Manetho's Egyptica. This is the ancient Greek major chronological source from the 3rd century BCE for the reigns of the kings of ancient Egypt, and different versions credit Psussenes I's reign as either 41 or 46 years. Some Egyptologists have suggested 51 years for Psussenes I, but this is all still under much discussion as there are some inconsistencies and lack of references to 21st dynasty kings in parts of Egypt during this time. What we do know is that even though Egypt may have been divided between Tanis and Thebes, Psussenes seemed to have been on good terms with the high priests of Amun in Thebes because the high priest Smendes II donated several grave goods to the king that were found in Psussenes II's tomb. During his reign, Psussenes I undertook building projects at the great temple at Tanis that was dedicated to the triad of gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. He was also the guy responsible for turning Tanis into a proper capital city. He surrounded the temple with a daunting brick temenos wall and reused blocks salvaged from the derelict city of Pi-Ramesses, a new capital that was built by Ramesses II but was soon left without water due to silting above the Nile, to build a sanctuary dedicated to Amun. The tomb of Psussenes I was discovered alongside those of multiple other kings from the 21st and 22nd dynasties by a French archaeological project led by Pierre Montet. In fact, this excavation project at Tanis is still ongoing with a French team today, showing just how long-lasting and impactful this project is proving to be. In February of 1939, while digging in the southwest corner of the temple complex at Tanis, a gold buckle and shapties attributed to a pharaoh named Shoshenq were found. Which Shoshenq is not known, and there were multiple throughout the 22nd and 23rd dynasties. These finds themselves were very intriguing because you don't normally find funerary items or burials inside temple enclosures, especially not within inhabited settlements. The story then goes that Montet used a stick to bang on what he thought was the stone floor of the building, but it sounded hollow. When that slab was removed, it turns out that this was no floor. It was actually a ceiling slab from the roof of a building. Montet went down into the room that was exposed by this ceiling removal, and he found himself in a sequence of chambers that were decorated with images and inscriptions, including cartouches of a pharaoh named Osorkon. Osorkon is a Libyan name which is characteristic of rulers of the 22nd and the 23rd dynasties. This is the point where alarm bells were certainly going off in Montet's head, like, wee woo, wee woo, wee woo. This is a royal tomb, like, whoa, whoa. I would have freaked out. I'm sure you would have freaked out. I'm sure he probably kept his cool, though, to be honest. He seems like a really chill guy. Montet wrote that he had the earth and stone blockings removed and went down into a square chamber with walls covered with figures and hieroglyphics. This led into another chamber with a large sarcophagus emerging from the earth, which filled 3/4 of 2 rooms. He even wrote that, quote, "Everyone is overjoyed." Understatement of the year, I'm sure, Mr. Montet. Turns out, Montet had rappelled down into a sort of antechamber that led into further chambers. This whole complex was given the name NRT-1 for the excavation report, which translates to Nécropole Royale de Tanis I, or Royal Tomb of Tanis I. The first chamber that Montet went into had a huge sarcophagus inside, but it was empty and we have absolutely no idea who might have been there. Chamber 2 was also empty, but Chamber 3 had another giant stone sarcophagus dating from the Middle Kingdom. So this is about 1,000 years before the Third Intermediate Period when this tomb was built. The chamber itself was also inscribed with descriptions of Osorkon, but the name on the repurposed sarcophagus was that of Takiloth I, which is another Libyan name. Takiloth I was the son of Osorkon I and father of Osorkon II, and a pharaoh of the 22nd dynasty. Another chamber was found containing the tomb of Osorkon II. At one point, it was also extended to accommodate one of his sons. The chamber itself was built from recycled monuments inscribed with the cartouches of Ramses II, and this burial was just ransacked. All that was found was 3 skeletons, some canopic jars, remains of a gilded coffin, jewelry fragments, and the gold frames of 2 falcon eyes, which were probably part of a falcon-headed coffin, which was a very popular coffin design in the 22nd dynasty. It was determined that these tombs under the temple were actually built into dug-out areas, and then that area around the tombs themselves was filled in with rubble so they could be buried and hidden from robbers. After the amazing discovery of NRT-1, Montet then discovered NRT-3, the only intact royal tomb ever found. When he entered a shaft at the eastern entrance of the tomb, Montet was confronted with another series of chambers decorated with inscriptions, but these cartouches had the name of Pasebkhanut, or Psussenes from the 21st dynasty. The entrance led into a short passageway and then into an antechamber. This space isn't a proper burial chamber, but inside was a solid silver falcon-headed coffin lying on top of a low plinth with 2 badly decomposed mummies on either side. Next to the coffin and the human remains were loads of jars and piles of Shabti statues. The coffin belonged to a pharaoh named Heka Kefere Shoshenq II, and it also had 4 solid silver canopic coffinettes to go with it. Inside the coffin was the pharaoh himself, an amazingly detailed solid gold funerary mask, a falcon-headed cartonnage, and masses of jewelry that had such fine craftsmanship. These bracelets, for example, made of gold and lapis lazuli containing the Wadjet Eye of Horus, are so famous and well known that the image of one graces the cover of this book right here, The Oxford History of Ancient Egypt. This was an essential book in my undergrad, and I really do recommend it for anyone looking for a great, concise introduction to ancient Egyptian history. I've left an affiliate link for anyone who's interested in it in the description down below. I've had it for about 10 years now, and it still never proves me wrong. So big thank you to Ian Shaw for getting me through my undergrad, and for Shoshenq II's eye bracelet for protecting me. There was so much in this antechamber that this section of NRT3 occupied Monte and his team for the remainder of the 1939 excavation season. But he did note at the end that there were 2 concealed entrances in the western wall of the tomb, one of which, in his mind, was presumably Psussenes I. By the next year, 1940, World War II had broken out, but despite this, Monte was able to return to Egypt and continue his work at Tanis. After performing some other investigations and discovering another tomb called NRT4 that was empty, but contained the coffin decorated for Psusenes' successor, Amenemope, Monte returned to NRT3 to break through the concealed doorways that he spotted the year before. Monte chose the chamber on the right first, and when he entered it, he had his own Howard Carter King Tut moment. This was the intact, undisturbed burial of Psusenes I. Inside the chamber was a very large sarcophagus that was originally made for the 19th dynasty king Meremptah, but transported over from the Valley of the Kings and reinscribed for Psusenes I. As you can see, there appears to be a trend of this state-sanctioned tomb robbing in the Third Intermediate period. Inside this outer sarcophagus was a second granite one in human form, and then within that, because the ancient Egyptians loved a good Russian nesting doll situation, was a human-headed, solid silver coffin inlaid with gold. Monte came face to face with the pharaoh himself. Due to Tanis being located in a moist Nile Delta environment in Lower Egypt, the organic materials like wood were not preserved, but the inorganic materials were plentiful. This is where the main differences between Psusenes I's and King Tut's tomb lie, and perhaps the reason it didn't get as much attention as the latter. The Valley of the Kings is very dry, which aided in the preservation of the many wooden artifacts in Tut's tomb. This, alongside the discovery being announced while during World War II was well underway, means that Psusenes I didn't get as much news coverage as Tut, and therefore never got his time in the limelight, even though his was the first entirely intact royal tomb ever found. Now, despite the poorly desiccated human remains and lack of organic objects, inside the silver coffin was a plethora of treasure. Gold items were everywhere. There was jewelry galore, an amazing decorated gold board, and a solid gold and lapis lazuli death mask that rivals that of King Tut. Psusenes I's mask is considered to be one of the masterpieces of the treasures of Tanis, and we can certainly see why. Psusenes I's fingers and toes were also encased in gold stalls, the finger ones being the most elaborate ones ever found, with sculpted fingernails on them. He was also buried with gold sandals on his feet, and each of his fingers wore an elaborate ring made of gold and lapis lazuli or other semi-precious stones. Dr. Douglas Derry, who was the head of Cairo University's anatomy department at the time, examined Psusenes I's remains and was able to determine that the king was old when he died. His teeth were badly worn and full of cavities, and he suffered from extensive arthritis that probably crippled him in the final years of his life. The discovery of the silver coffins of Psusenes I and Shoshenq II gives way to the idea that perhaps the Third Intermediate period wasn't one of decline, but of considerable wealth, at least for the kings. In Egypt, silver was considerably rarer than gold, which means that these silver coffins are sumptuous displays of great wealth during Egypt's supposed declining years. As you can see, there is still so much wealth, skill, and craftsmanship present during this time. Not to mention the very long reign of Psusenes I as well, especially during a time of political division and instability. Monte was now in a race against time with World War II and his excavations. King Farouk of Egypt did persuade him to open the second chamber to the left of Psusenes I in April of 1940, just 1 month before Hitler invaded France. And inside, there was another intact royal tomb, that of Amenemope, Psusenes I's son. Remember, Monte already found Amenemope's stone sarcophagus outside in NRT-4, but it was empty. Turns out this second chamber was originally for Psusenes' wife, but was then repurposed for Amenemope. We don't know why this happened or where Psusenes' wife went, unfortunately, so that is hopefully something we'll find out in the future. But inside this chamber were canopic jars, stone vessels, an uninscribed granite sarcophagus, 400 shabtis, gold jewelry, and gilt funerary masks, though they weren't on the same level of craftsmanship of that of Psusenes I. After World War II, Monte was able to return to Egypt and resume his work in Tanis. He opened Chamber 3 of NRT-3, which was being prepared for a son of Psusenes, Ankefenmut, but the inscriptions were tampered with, and he was never buried there. It's possible that he fell from grace and wasn't given a princely burial because of this. Now, there was one final chamber in NRT-3, and what's so unique about it is that there was no access to it from anywhere inside the tomb. The only way archaeologists could get to it was through the roof, and it was almost missed during the excavations because of this. This was the tomb of the high-ranking general and priest Wenja. This was, of course, so well hidden that it was also perfectly intact and untouched by robbers. Can you imagine finding not one, not two, but 3 intact tombs inside the same tomb, 2 of which were royal? I swear I'd have a heart attack right there and then. Bury me with the pharaohs. Bury me right there. I'm dead. Wenja was buried with 3 gold and silver plates, jewelry, and had his own gold death mask. It was his high rank and honor that must have allowed him to be buried in the royal necropolis, even though he himself was not royal. Since we've gone through almost every tomb in this area, let's just finish them all up in this video, shall we? After the very exciting finds of a lifetime in NRT-3, Monte exposed NRT-5, which had 2 chambers for 22nd Dynasty kings Usur-Marte Setepenre Shoshenq III and Hedge-Kepere Setepenre Shoshenq IV. There is also an NRT-2 that was an extension of NRT-1. We don't know the functional purpose of this room, but there were fragments of canopic jars inside that might belong to the king Pami of the 22nd dynasty. Now, very quickly, I want to go back to NRT-3 and NRT-1 for a little bit to discuss some loose ends and a conspiracy theory, because it's ancient Egypt and there always seems to be a conspiracy theory. Firstly, who were the 2 poorly preserved mummies that were found on either side of the silver falcon coffin of Shoshenq II? In the pile of shabtis that was next to the plinth that they were on were some that had the names of pharaohs Siamun and Psusenes II, the last 2 kings of the 21st dynasty. Therefore, that is who these extra mummies might be. What's interesting to note about NRT-3 and NRT-1 is that they have a very strange chronology. NRT-3, which was decorated for Psusenes I, a 21st dynasty king, appears to have been built after NRT-1, which was decorated for Osorkon II, a 22nd dynasty king. How is that possible? Well, this gives conspiracy theorists fuel to say that the 2 dynasties overlapped with one another. But here's what probably happened instead if we use Occam's razor, with the simplest answer probably being the correct one. The burials in these buildings are just much later than the construction. NRT1 and NRT3 look connected on the site plan, but it seems that they were originally two buildings. What might have happened is that NRT1 was built at the beginning of the 21st dynasty for the earlier kings, then NRT3 was built for Psussenes I and his successor, that was then extended to add in two more chambers that required them to build into NRT1. NRT1 was then possibly adapted by Osorkon II, and he might have brought his father Takeloth I here to be buried with him. The earlier king that NRT1 might have originally belonged to can only be either Smendes I or Amenemnisu, as both of those tombs are currently unaccounted for. Now, why would this happen? What would have required Osorkon II to usurp someone else's tomb? Well, there is a bit of a gap in the use of the tombs at the end of the 21st dynasty and the beginning of the 22nd. We currently don't have the tombs of the last two kings of Dynasty 21, Siamun or Psusenes II, or the first two kings of Dynasty 22, Shoshenq I and Osorkon I. Even though, as we mentioned earlier, we do probably have the remains of Siamun and Psusenes II. Studies on the human remains suggest that they may have been lying in standing water for some time in another location, hence their poor state of decomp. This might explain why they were brought to Tanis from somewhere else. It's possible that their original resting place was flooded, which then called for their rescue and relocation. The fact that Shoshenq II was also found with them, not in a larger stone sarcophagus and not in a proper burial chamber, but in the antechamber of Psusenes I, also suggests that he might have been brought in from somewhere else as well. It's been suggested that Shoshenq I's missing tomb might be at Memphis, thanks to an inscription of a canopic chest that we have of his. If that is the case, then Memphis could have had a revival as a capital city in Egypt when it was briefly reunited at the beginning of the 22nd dynasty. Memphis was being used for members of the royal family at this time, as we can see by the burial of Osorkon II's son, who was chief priest of Ptah. But it has also been suggested that a royal necropolis was set up in Tel Basta at Bubastis as well. Of course, we won't be able to determine anything until we find more evidence, and for that, we must keep digging. Until then, we can only marvel at the Silver Pharaohs and their unmatched and untouched wealth during such a tumultuous time in ancient Egyptian history. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. If you liked that video, you know what to do. Go ahead and smash that like button, smash the subscribe button so you never miss another video. Big thank you to all of my patrons over on Patreon. If you like the channel, you want to help support the channel, head on over to Patreon. The link is in my description. As always, stay dirty, my friends.